Gentlemen, hello. Hello. My name is Imogen Sinclair, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this afternoon's discussion on economic democracy and political participation. It's also very useful because I'm speaking tomorrow, so I get to size you all up for my own panel, work out where everyone's coming from. Right, economic democracy and political participation. My hope is that over the next 90 minutes or so, we will have a useful discussion about what kind of lives we want to live. And this was the kind of key theme of the manifesto that I hope you've all been diligently reading and annotating. What kind of lives do we want to live? And then turn to how our political economy can support this, can support human flourishing, not how might human beings slot into a utilitarian, vicious cycle of propping up liberal, elite, globalised interests, which unfortunately too often have become our government's interest too. One remark that stood out to me, which we may or may not get into this afternoon, this was on page 8 of the manifesto. I have been studying and annotating the piece. Is this remark which says we need to end the implicit denial that our paid economy depends upon the security of the unpaid domestic sphere. And I think that this is too often ignored by politicians on left and right. Without further ado, let me introduce the panel this afternoon. Where's my list of panellists? You're on the screen, but you're also here. And I have what you do. Dan Carden, MP, Labour MP for Liverpool, Walton. Are you still the safest seat, Dan?
I think it was.
Excellent.
Share of votes.
Excellent, there you go. Safest seat in Parliament. I have Jonathan Clark, British historian, Professor Emeritus of British History at the University of Kansas. Will Hutton, President, Academy of Social Sciences, columnist and author. And Munira, Mirza, Director of Civic Future and former head of the Number 10 Policy Unit from 2019 to 2022. We agreed a running order, didn't we? And I think we said, Munira, you're up first. In the interest of time, if you could attempt to keep your remarks relatively brief, that would all help us enormously. Munira.
Thank you, Imogen. Thank you, Adrian, for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's been a really fascinating day. I've got some good news, I've got some bad news. The good news is that I wrote a speech that's exactly 9 minutes long. The bad news is that I've heard so many interesting things today that I've had to add bits to my speech, so I'm now going to speak for about 3 hours. Just kidding. Thank you very much to all of you for staying and for not leaving to do your Christmas shopping. I know that was probably very tempting. We've heard many points today about the failings in the current system, both in the UK and the US and more generally across liberal democracies. In the economy, in public services, in our social relationships, in our culture, there is a palpable sense of things coming apart. We're seeing an extraordinary rise in wealth inequality, not the kind driven by an exciting growth of new ideas and new products or by leaps in productivity, but the kind driven by economic stagnation, low investment, declining profitability, and rent-seeking behaviour. In the West, the rich are able to get very rich, but the poor are stuck. And I think one academic put it very well when he said, it's never been easier to become a billionaire, and it's never been harder to become a millionaire. There's a very strong sense that the economy is just not working for many people. And in Britain, there has been a flatlining of living standards and only a 0.5% real wage growth since the 2008 crash. Of course, we have to keep a sense of perspective. Many things in our society and in our daily lives has improved. We've seen the reduced cost of many goods, access to things that were once out of reach, from things like modern smartphones, cheap flights, even free entry to museums. A number of those things have been made possible by the concentration of power that comes from big economies of scale, the kind of thing that was being railed against by Lord Glassman, the way in which big companies can reduce the costs of things. But at the same time as all those good things, we can see that the big ticket items that once defined success in people's lives, owning your own home, having a car, being able to go on nice holidays, I think Claire Ainsley put it very well this morning, those things feel out of reach to many people. And in public services, which so many people depend on, we've seen a huge deterioration of quality and experience. There's less money in public services, of course. I'm talking particularly now about the UK situation. There's been less productivity improvement, less improvement overall. But there are some success stories. We've seen technological improvements in health diagnoses. We've seen huge improvements in education in the UK. But no one can look at the GP waiting lists or the 18-month delays in courts or the armoured vehicles that don't work and feel that the system overall has got better. So all this points to some uncomfortable truths for those of us who believe in capitalism and the power of markets. Historically, I think David Pan put it very well this morning, he said, capitalism has driven an enormous improvement in living standards and access to wealth for the poorest, particularly in what we call the global south, and it still does so today. And nothing I've heard today shakes my belief in that fundamental. I hate to tell it to you, Morris. I'm still a pro-capitalist person. But in order for capitalism to be successful, it must be vigilant and protected from its worst elements. It must be safe from itself. And there are just too many things wrong with our system that need to be fixed. Businesses who try to keep their monopolies and block competition. Employers who have illegal working practices. The government in the UK named 500 this year who do not pay the minimum wage, including some major high street brands. And although most employers are responsible, the government and the regulators have to catch the ones that aren't. And when I worked in government, I felt very strongly that we should increase the funding for the enforcement agencies, tiny bits of funding that would stop sweatshop labour conditions, which are happening in parts of this country, which I think is shocking. The government is itself partly responsible for the incentives that drive business behaviour. If you're a business, why train up apprentices at great cost or invest in automation if the government allows you and your competitors access to cheap migrant labour? Why pay tax here if the government doesn't require it? And if you ask any focus group in the country what are the things that drive them mad, they'll ask, why isn't Amazon paying more tax? If you can't build the infrastructure as a business that you want to expand what you do due to complex planning rules, why then bother investing in anything at all? Why not just invest your surplus in financial engineering and pay your shareholders more? So the political right has to get out of its comfort zone and talk about these things and stop defending things that are indefensible. But, this is my contrarian streak, I would say that the political left also needs to get out of its comfort zone. Sometimes what passes for workers' rights or collectivism or what's called economic democracy is itself responsible for some of our problems, and I'll explain what I mean. One of the reasons we have low growth in the UK is the low rate of productivity improvement in the public sector. Government spending is about 45% of GDP, and it would be remiss not to mention the role of the large public sector trade unions as a reason for that stalling of progress and innovation. I would argue that too often they are in the interest of protecting their members, blocking modernisation and innovation that is commonplace elsewhere. I can feel I'm losing the room slightly. I will give you an example. Take the railways. For 20 years, the railway unions in the UK have blocked important changes like driverless trains and automated ticket stations that would have made our system vastly cheaper to operate, safer and more efficient. In Switzerland and in other European countries, even on the London Underground, there have been driverless trains for years without any problems, but they have been blocked by the unions on the grounds of safety. In Britain, we have the bizarre situation of the Brighton to London service has two different operating companies, one that is allowed by its union to use driverless trains and one that isn't, and no accidents have happened on either. We have a couple of dozen ticket stations open in London that sell on average 1 ticket a day, but the unions have blocked their closure. We have voluntary working on Sundays for rail drivers, which means that when there's an important football match or when it's Christmas, those drivers do not have to work, and there is a shortage of drivers across the service. And it means that there are whole swathes of Northern England where it's extremely difficult to travel. There's a shortage of rail drivers generally, artificially constrained by over-the-top training requirements, strict rules about hiring, and an effective shutdown of training during COVID. When it comes to performance management, the unions have made it nearly impossible to fire drivers. I remember times when I was working in City Hall in London where the rail unions were threatened to walk out because the TfL, Transport for London, wanted to fire a driver that had turned up to work drunk. And these are the kinds of things that the rail unions would defend. By the way, this isn't just an evil Tory government that the rail unions are targeting. Sadiq Khan, the Labour Mayor of London, came to power promising to work constructively with the unions. But there have been more strike days, 130, under Sadiq than under the previous guy. I can't remember his name. The need for reform and modernisation is even more critical since COVID, because passenger numbers are down and government subsidy has gone up. But rather than fearing for more cuts to services, the unions have been threatening further strikes. It's not just the rail unions. Teaching unions in the UK have repeatedly blocked reforms designed to improve school performance and accountability. They opposed league tables, they opposed Ofsted inspections, they opposed free schools and academisation, they opposed phonics tests, all of which have proven over time to drive up outcomes for children. The nursing unions, not by any stretch the most belligerent, demanded university degrees for all nurses in the 2010s, ramping up the costs of training places and artificially restricting how many UK applicants can enter the system. So we now have a system of nursing recruitment entirely engineered for the benefit of the existing members, the existing producers, that makes it cheaper for hospitals to recruit nurses from abroad and passes the costs of that immigration onto wider society. This is short-termism of the worst kind, where protecting existing workers from change leads to the stalling of progress. Lest we forget, it was in the 1900s that the Fabian Society opposed the employment of married women. When my parents came to Britain in the 1970s, the union closed shop excluded women and ethnic minorities. I could go on. We have seen how the unions and other groups speaking on behalf of the working class have campaigned for a legalism and compliance culture in the workplace, which makes it extremely hard to run any kind of organisation. It was a combination of unions, HR bodies, and employment lawyers who pushed for tighter and tighter legislation and compliance around pay and workers' rights, which end up making it very difficult for employers, the majority of whom run small and medium businesses, to performance manage someone out of a company. And for anyone who's worked in the civil service, I can tell you, and you will understand, the frustration of not being able to fire anyone or finding it very difficult to do so. We have seen how unions have also shifted away from generalised campaigns for improving pay and conditions to an obsession with identity politics and discrimination, defending claims being brought over microaggression and so-called sexist and racist jokes. I will point out, though, that the unions do not organise walkouts for certain kinds of cases. So I saw Kathleen Stock here earlier. I don't know how many of the academic unions came out to defend you or organise walkouts when you were under threat from your employers and your colleagues. Or indeed the case of the teacher at Batley Grammar School who is still in hiding after being fired by his school for showing a picture of the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. The recent court case against Next and Birmingham City Council awarded historic claims for gender pay disparity with entirely new interpretations of equality law, stating that employers should not be paying according to market rate and optimising profit, but should be trying to close the gender pay gap. And that example, that case, I think, complicates the narrative that it's the corporates that are in charge. I think that something more interesting, more complicated is going on, which is that the courts and legalism, which is being driven by a number of the organisations I've talked about, is driving some of the dysfunctions in our current system. That case, the case against Next, has practically bankrupted Birmingham City Council, and it's leading to costly fines for major employers in this country, and I think it will scare off investors. My colleague, Pamela Dow, who was a civil servant for around 15 years, has recently written in the New Statesman about the enormous expansion of HR in the UK and how the growth in HR officers seems to correlate with a growth in work tribunal claims, rising sick days, and general unhappiness in the workplace. In the public sector and the civil service, the sludge of bureaucracy has got worse, not better. And these are all changes that are being made in the name of protecting workers. I say all this not to be simply contrarian, although I like being contrarian, so it's my natural instinct, nor to say a curse on both houses, but because I think both the left and the right need to see how their very good intentions can lead to quite perverse outcomes. And in total, they can slow down growth, the kind of growth that we need to improve living standards for the many and not the few. There's one third force of conservatism I would mention, which I'm afraid I wouldn't have time to talk about, but I could talk about it for hours, which I think is the force in this country that is the most keen to defend a conception of the good life, of community, of relationships, of places where people know each other and feel comfortable and it's familiar, which is the movement of NIMBYs, people who want to oppose housing in their areas. Now, I'm very sympathetic to the NIMBY cause because I understand the kind of change that they fear. But we have to recognise that conceptions of the good life can often be used by people who want to oppose change altogether. And that opposing of change means that we're not building enough houses for people to live the good life, which I was talking about earlier. Unlike some people who have spoken earlier today, I don't think liberalism is the enemy. I think liberalism is the solution to many of these problems. Because at its best, it is a liberalism of vigilance that has a self-correcting mechanism that allows us to look at the system and work out where there are concentrations of power and where we can have a check against those concentrations of power. Somebody quoted Stalin earlier, who said, not to endorse him in any way, Stalin I mean, that there are no invincible armies. To quote Lenin, there is no completely hopeless situation. And I think the point about liberalism is that it gives us certain tools to look at the failures of the existing system and it allows us to correct and improve. To quote another Marxist, Henrik Grossman talked about capitalism's counteracting tendencies, the ability of capitalism to survive and to not tend towards breakdown. Now, he was saying this in a kind of, God, it's so frustrating. They keep surviving, these bloody capitalists. But it is also a sign that the system can react and can respond to resistance, to political campaigns, to dysfunctions in the way that markets operate. And I would say, therefore, that there is an argument that liberalism is absolutely not exhausted, that it has many of the solutions and many of the tools that could allow us to depart from our present moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Imogen. It's lovely to be here today and to follow Munira. I was going to open my speech by saying I feel relaxed about what I'm going to say today because I've heard everything articulated so well before I have to speak and agreed with most of what's been said today. But I will actually say, and probably a majority of what you said as well, Munira. But Munira and I know each other and have had plenty of conversations in the past. I've been asked to speak to you today about economic democracy and political participation. I thought I would start with my first personal experience of economic democracy and political participation because my dad was a Liverpool dock worker. And I might just take this moment to thank President-elect Trump on his backing of the US longshoremen and their unions, and for his stance, contrary to Munira's, where he has actually said the amount of money saved is nowhere near the distress, hurt, and harm it causes for American workers on the topic of automation. And so these are strange political times we live in. But my dad was a Liverpool dock worker, and when I was 8 years of age, he led an industrial dispute. 500 Liverpool dock workers refused to cross a picket line, and he was left unemployed for 7 years, and obviously that had a tremendous effect on my upbringing in Liverpool. But my understanding of employment and labour was a familial one. It was a community one. It was the dockers' club, the dockers' families, the women of the waterfront, the wives. It was about pride and dignity. It was never just about a job, paying the bills, or earning money. And today, I'm a Labour MP. And you might remember that Labour MPs were told they shouldn't be attending picket lines not too long ago. But it's not something that I would ever skirt my responsibility to do. And I want to talk a little bit today, almost in layman's terms, as a representative, about my constituency, about the lives of the people who live in Liverpool Walton, and that I try and represent in Parliament. And I might finish, if I have enough time, with a little personal tale about my outlook on politics today. Yesterday I attended the reopening of Spellow Hub Library on County Road in Liverpool Walton. It was set alight during the riots, and it's on the main thoroughfare through Walton. And the one thing that stuck in my mind from yesterday, which was a very uplifting event and brought the community together, but the one thing that stuck in my mind was that the riots closed one library, but over the last 15 years, this country has closed over 1,000 libraries. And I can't get that out of my head. Liverpool Walton is ranked the most deprived constituency in the whole of England. It has economic problems, it has social problems. It also has wonderful communities. And I'm often asked as a member of Parliament, what is the biggest issue that you deal with on a day-to-day basis? And so I'm used to saying now, poverty. Poverty is the biggest issue that I deal with, because it is, we deal with families being evicted from their homes and all these things, but all of it comes down to poverty, a lack of money in people's pockets. But I did want today to delve a little deeper into that reply that I give, because I've also come to realise simply injecting money somewhere is not an answer to solving some of the deep civilisational problems that I think Britain is contending with today. It would help my constituents pay their bills, pay rip-off utility bills. It would help them pay extortionate rents and rising prices. But what would it do beyond that? One thing I know is that it is possible to be poor and yet have dignity, love, happiness, wonderful relationships, faith, and that's what my upbringing taught me. And so I thought again, perhaps when people ask me, what's the biggest thing that you deal with in Liverpool Walton, I should answer the systematic economic and political exclusion of human beings by modern liberal capitalism. No? Yes. No? And let me say, as a Labour MP, I think one of the greatest mistakes since 1945 was the exclusion of the workforce from any form of power in the economic system. And Wolfgang Bevan delivered it for Germany, but he never managed to deliver it for Britain. Poverty causes many problems, and we should always be shocked by it in this country, one of the richest in the world. But it is just one of the devastating consequences of the modern economic and political system. So much of that has already been covered. I'm aware that I'm in a room full of people who've contributed a great deal to this debate about how an era of globalization has worsened the lives of the working class, about how an elite are satisfied with the situation where participation is something that takes place once every 5 years, political participation and economic participation, and that liberalism has cut people away from their social bonds. It's atomized people, it's made us more lonely and vulnerable. Because we have endured decades of the politics and economics of the individual and the importance of radical identity politics, I think my challenge to that, and the simple way to talk about these things, is the knowledge that what can sometimes be good for the individual can actually be harmful to the community. And we've had a fascinating debate in recent months on the assisted dying bill, where all these sorts of ideas have been debated and shared. On today's government, I share some of the concerns that have been aired today, that this sort of utilitarian deliverism of government will be shown in the end to fail the true demands of the true demands and the true needs of the British people. And I want to give one example of this, because housing is such an important issue up and down the country, but particularly in an area like mine. The government's promised to build 1.5 million homes, and I think I'm right in saying that the last government built 1 million homes in the last Parliament. The housing problems in Liverpool, Walton are actually emblematic of how modern liberal capitalism has wrought destruction across those communities. So we have 100-year-old terraced houses on streets in deprived neighbourhoods, and these are bought up by landlords in London, Manchester, further afield, at prices that you wouldn't believe. Down here, you can buy terraced houses for perhaps 60, 70,000 pounds in parts of my constituency. They're bought up not just by landlords, but by corporations. They're bought up by Serco to house asylum seekers or other vulnerable and dispossessed people. Terraced houses are converted into multi-occupancy homes so that multiple individuals can live in them. And families and younger generations are simply moved on and pushed away. And the streets no longer represent that cohesive community that we need to have bustling areas, as well as having a lack of financial means. And so the real challenge, I think, for government is to see that working class communities have lost control of their housing, they've lost their homes, and we need a plan to return that power to them. And housing associations, again, another institution, a quasi-governmental, unresponsive, unaccountable to the interests of the working class. And I think today people's experiences of all of this are beginning to radicalise their politics. I want to finish on one personal note, which is this year was 5 years since I had an alcoholic drink. I started going to AA 5 years ago, and people sort of are interested to know a bit about how that experience has been for me. But it's been something that now feeds into my political outlook on things. And I think that's because I was someone who had to, who required intervention from outside to change, who required a hell of a lot of willpower to make a change for myself, and learned through that process the importance of people and community and relationships and bonds to everything that we do, that things cannot be solved for us by somebody else from above. And so I see that grounding as part of my politics and my understanding of the things that really create a society, create a community, and support us all to to live the most effective lives that we can. I think we need more of that in our politics, more of people being brought together, more trust in our communities and localism. And AA might just be one little bit of that, but it's a community that I found incredibly powerful, and I learned a lot from, and I like to use that in the way that I try and look at some of the problems that are facing a community like mine. Thank you very much.
I have a lectern here full of stuff about virtue, so I'll have to get rid of that if I can before we go further. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've explored some very important general questions so far. And one of the greatest ones is the future of the nation state. I can report to you with complete certainty on this. The nation state is over, it's breaking up. I bring you fraternal greetings from the newly re-established Kingdom of Northumbria. That is deepest, darkest Northumbria. You must understand our values are not like your values. In fact, we still have men and women up there. When I come down to Cambridge, I'm never quite sure. Well, I come under the pretense today of being a historian, and I know I'm surrounded by political scientists and political activists. So at the outset, please forgive me if I make just 3 very general historical points. They're elementary, but they are my premises. First, everything changes. That's true on the micro level. Here we are in Corpus Christi College. I'm reminded that I joined the college 50 years ago. I'm reminded that though the walls remain, the life lived within those walls has completely changed. And that is true of political parties also. My second premise is that everything changes further and faster than we like. The public has a deep need for continuity, and that hope is regularly disappointed. My third point, despite points 1 and 2, my third premise is that the bourgeois intelligentsia are remarkably unwilling to accept the analytical point that everything has changed, is changing, and will continue to change. Instead, they, above all, are the people who prefer the old certainties. Activists say, just read my latest book and you will discover that I was right all along. Surprise, surprise. Specifically, liberalism. The term survives, but it's come to mean, as we all know, a great miscellany, an inconsistent miscellany of things on both sides of the Atlantic. One might sum up this problem by saying that in the vision of activists, liberalism is merely a synonym for my correct values. And so Francis Fukuyama wrote a recent article in the FT analyzing the victory of Donald Trump as he called a decisive rejection by American voters of liberalism. But he defined liberalism to prove his argument. He wrote, classical liberalism is a doctrine built around respect for the equal dignity of individuals through a rule of law that protects their rights and through constitutional checks on the state's ability to interfere with those rights. This, he wrote, was true liberalism. The other versions were, quote, distorted understandings. So everyone has their own version of liberalism, at least since it was originally conceptualized in England around 1820. And that's not at all what it meant in 1820 in England. And if liberalism can now mean anything, it means nothing as a term of academic analysis. And it becomes dangerous if we believe in these wide, vague generalizations, and it becomes more unstable if we pile one overextended generalization on top of another, as with the phrase liberal democracy. States all around the world claim to be liberal democracies, or people's republics, and often they are the most bloodthirsty of ones. And the phrase merely becomes in Jeremy Bentham's memorable response to universal human rights in the 1790s, nonsense upon stilts. And that's not just an English problem, it's a Europe-wide problem, a transatlantic problem. Consider Germany. There the government, as you know, has lost its majority. It's directionless at a time of European war. Or France, of which The Economist recently noted, and I quote, "The country's crass and obstructive political discourse only accelerates the drift to the extremes." In neither Germany nor France is democracy promoted by the old underlying ideology of liberalism. Now, in the USA, we might debate whether the Republicans support republicanism or the Democrats support democracy, but neither advocate liberalism or socialism or conservatism in any historical sense. The term liberalism never featured in the US Constitution of 1787 and has never been added in its amendments. And the idea that states have founding principles, an idea especially beloved, with all great respect to Americans in the audience, that idea is disastrously and demonstrably false. That is not how states are founded. And the UK is in only a slightly better position. More revealingly, a ministry with an historically high majority finds itself historically short of policies. Much depends on the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I wish her well. But her book, The Women Who Made Modern Economics, ran into difficulties over its authorship and its sources, and her CV ran into difficulties over her successive claims to have been an economist, difficulties that have practical consequences in her first budget. So, as an historian, I ask, how has this situation arisen over time? I answer, in the UK, politics since the early 19th century has been dominated, to simplify, by three great ideologies: liberalism, socialism, and conservatism. They partly overlapped, but one by one they have dissolved. These terms were once proper names for clearly defined doctrines. They no longer are. Why do ideologies disappear? I answer for two reasons. One, they partly succeed. Two, they partly fail. Liberalism, the name for a specific doctrine, was formulated around 1820 as a cultural critique of the world of church and king. This critique largely succeeded. Later, other things were added to the name, the goals of free trade, franchise extension, and religious pluralism. These things, too, largely succeeded. But then, as the new liberalism, the form it took from about 1890 to 1914, an attempt to spread prosperity more widely, it largely failed. By 2024, liberalism in Britain means largely niceness. I am a tolerant liberal. You fail fully to appreciate my virtue. He is a bigot. By meaning everything, liberalism has come to mean nothing. So this is a post-liberalism conference. But I want to argue that it is also and equally a post-socialism conference and a post-conservatism conference. What is my evidence for that? Very briefly, I make 6 points. First, liberalism died in the 1920s as electorates increasingly turned to a socialist party. Socialism died, a symbolic moment, with the growing prosperity of workers from the 1950s to 1979. In 1975, Tony Blair, as you know, appropriately amended Clause 4 of the Labour Party constitution to relegate socialism to a formal party without policy implications. Out went the commitment adopted in 1918 to achieve the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Conservatism died with Margaret Thatcher, whose doctrine can be summarized as Hayekian radical individualism, not much in common with conservatism there, and who almost never spoke to Roger Scruton, I discover from her biography, and was buried, conservatism was buried by Theresa May, who had no doctrine and sacked Roger Scruton without even a hearing. Point 2, going back is never possible. Every ideology follows a trajectory from conceptualization through popularization, through hegemony, through unpopularity, through irrelevance, to what I call deconceptualization. That's what I'm doing at the moment in my work as an historian. I'm a deconceptualizer. I undo all the concepts. What ideologies have ever actually been raised from the dead? Feudalism? Divine right monarchy? I'm all ears. I will listen with respect to your arguments on that point. Third point, who is even trying to resuscitate these ideologies? Liberalism? Who now reads Cobden or Bright or Mill? Whoever read them through? Conservatism? Jesse Norman commends Edmund Burke. Very fine, but here is a problem. Burke was not a conservatism. Keir Starmer did once say, "I am a socialist," unquote, but these isolated words don't prescribe his actions, and he tries not to repeat them. He announced in the election that he wanted to benefit the workers, but famously he couldn't define them. Why? Because he could not rely on the concept of the working class. It's entirely lost traction as an analytical concept. My fourth point, policy formation. The general election, though long expected, saw all three parties scrabble around for policies, and each had a remarkable difficulty in finding any. Go back and reread the Lib Dem manifesto. It offered a right to see a GP within 7 days, water companies to be banned from dumping raw sewage, to give taxpayers real value for money, whatever that means, to plant at least 60 million trees a year. Splendid, I do that. Not 60 million, but I do plant trees. A promise to create new cycling and walking networks, and to make misogyny a hate crime. The Labour manifesto promised to cut NHS waiting times. Yes, he was against that. To crack down on antisocial behaviour. He was against that. To halve serious violent crime. To tackle tax avoidance. To establish a border security command. The Conservative manifesto included banning the use of mobile phones during the school day, earth-shattering commitments, investing in technology for the NHS, excellent, and best of all, launching a seaside heritage fund. And so we might debate the merits of all these policies and others, but one thing we can say with certainty, none of them was historically liberal or socialist or conservative. And appropriately, the terms liberalism, socialism, and conservatism were absent from the three-party manifestos. Fifth point, political rhetoric. Many people complain about the decline of the quality of political debate. Ideas are less and less discussed. And instead, political conflicts, I suggest, increasingly resemble circular firing squads with nothing in the center. Denunciation takes the place of debate. And so in the Telegraph, the left almost always appears as the far left. If you read The Guardian, the right is almost always the far right, and activists of both parties react against the intolerant, egotistical center, and it's only a matter of time, I predict, before the new term, my new term, enters the lexicon, the far center. You heard it here first. And sixthly, the reactions of experienced individuals. Will Hutton, on our panel, in a recent article of The Observer, compared his ideals with the new Labour government. And he concluded, and I quote him, "After making more mistakes in its first 100 days than any post-war government, the title sounds like a cry into the void. What is Labour's vision for the country? The party's leadership relegates the importance of ideas in political philosophy. Ideas are the lifeblood of politics. Without a philosophy, the politician blows in the wind and has no definition. I warmly agree with him. Take Munira Mirza, at a different point on the political spectrum, director of the number 10 policy unit in 2019-22, founder of Civic Forum. Its website explains its aims, and I quote, "The challenges of emerging technologies, geopolitical conflicts, and demographic shifts need leaders equipped to address them." In a paper to the Engelsberg seminar in Sweden in 2023, she lamented, and I quote, "Political parties struggle to generate new ideas and resort to familiar rhetoric invented for problems from decades ago. More than anything, a new generation of political leaders struggle to find a way to communicate their views at any length or articulate a vision with depth." I can only say historians are worse. They've got no new ideas either, completely useless. And to complete her quote, she says, "When politicians go on reality TV shows to try to engage an increasingly detached electorate, they are signaling that politics is more about personality than purpose or ideas." Don't we know that to be true? I entirely agree with her. Natasha Engel, a Labour MP in 2005 to 17, is now Chief Executive Officer of a think tank, Palace Yard, and its webpage proclaims, I quote her, "There are many excellent think tanks in London, all expert at grappling with the minutiae of public policy, but what's missing is the really big picture." And she says the aim of Palace Yard is, quote, "to write about what works and what doesn't." I entirely agree with her. These two institutions are cross-party. Both might be described as technocratic. What prompted them? Again, I quote Munira Mirza. She concludes, "All the changes I've described in the UK have taken place almost without comment or concern in the last 40 years or so." Listen carefully to that. I agree with her. What happened in these decades? I answer, the failure of attempts to revive liberalism, the abandonment by Labour of socialism, the demonstrated emptiness of conservatism. Contrast this with the three great parties in the past. They had conferences and colleges to train a younger generation in liberalism, socialism, and conservatism. In the 1920s, the Liberal Party had liberal summer schools at Oxford. The Labour Party had affiliated groups that met and debated at length, like the Fabian Society. For conservatism, Swinton College ran from 1948 until 1976, when, revealingly, Margaret Thatcher abolished it. There was even a conservative philosophy group from 1974. It disbanded, revealingly, during John Major's premiership. Civic Future and New Palace Yard seek to train a younger generation as well-informed and skilled practical operators in the increasingly complex business of government. Who can object to that? I don't. I applaud their work. I only point out, as an historian, that things have changed further and faster than the activists would like. So I think, listening to the enormously sophisticated debates in this conference so far, there are two big possibilities about the way forward. One is to argue that liberalism or socialism or conservatism can be revived, they can be resuscitated, they can be adapted, improved, revitalized, and made to be solutions for all our problems. The other big answer is to say, you don't have to wipe the board clean. It is already wiped clean. We start again from the ground up. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation to say a few words about the post-liberal order and the good life. I was mildly surprised, actually, to be invited. I'm not certain I define myself as a post-liberal, but I'm certainly interested in how to configure kind of capitalism, society, kind of better governance to produce a life that most of our citizens, if hopefully all of them, can lead lives they have reason to value. And in the book that I wrote, which led me to be so despairing about the first 100 days, thank you for the quote, I begin with saying that in this sense we are living in a post-liberal order, in that the notion that capitalism will self-organize to best outcomes has visibly been proven false. And what I would say to Munira, I enjoyed her opening remarks, but I'd remind her that in a workforce of over 30 million, only 5 million are organized in public sector trade unions. And when you try to kind of tease out why productivity is poor, you can't blame people who work in the 5 million. You've got to think about what's happening in the lion's share of the economy, where our capitalism is plainly not working as well as it could and should. It was actually 100 years ago, almost to the month, that Keynes delivered his great lecture that kind of was to prefigure the Keynesian revolution, in which he argued that laissez-faire was dead. It had failed Britain broadly from kind of the exhibition of Crystal Palace in 1851 right up to 1924. Markets weren't self-organizing, capitalism needed guide rails. The economy that would work was plainly one that was mixed. He advised you shouldn't return to the gold standard, that actually free trade, uninhibited, was likely to produce poor results, and. It took 20 years before his message was heeded. 30 good years followed. And then we, as everyone knows, we lived through the kind of period from 1979 to today. And so what I tried to do in the book, and the way my thinking kind of intersects with this conference's agenda, is actually to see if it's possible to put together a political economy and beneath it a political philosophy that might be more durable than the one that couldn't underpin the Keynesian revolution. And where I get to, and in this sense, I suppose I'm just thinking about what Jonathan was saying. I'm kind of both recognizing that it's almost a clean page, but there's kind of lots in both liberalism and socialism, and the people who thought about these questions deeply of the previous 200 years that can be mined to help us. So it may be that top-down statist socialism is dead, but I would go with Tony Blair and say that an ethic of socialism is an enduring value. It represents the we, it represents mutuality, it represents fellowship, it represents kind of having each other's backs. It recognizes that actually one's likely to get to better outcomes by pulling together than by acting oneself. And indeed, when Attlee was asked in 1955 to define socialism, that was his answer. Fellowship, he said. I follow William Morris. Fellowship is the life of the world. But here again, this is where I slightly depart from the post-liberal kind of consensus, in that I think there has to be a place for individualism. There has to be a place for individual ambition, for recognizing that people want to live lives they have reason to value as individuals. They have ambitions, they have aims, they have preferences, they have tastes which need to be respected. And here I wanted to kind of borrow from Thomas Green, the new liberal, who's slightly kind of cast aside, I felt, a bit too quickly by Jonathan, whose great book, The Politics of Obligation, kind of opened up a reconceptualization of what liberalism meant at the end of the 19th century, which I still think has kind of lessons for us now. Essentially, he was saying, individual responsibility, ambition, kind of individual choice, acting in markets is kind of really important. But individuals have responsibility to the whole. The social whole, the stronger the social whole, the stronger you are as an individual, and you as an individual have responsibility to that whole. And that was an insight that really kind of led straight to the People's Budget, the Asquith government, and beyond it, Keynes and Beveridge, who are of that new liberal tradition. So what I try to argue in that an emergent political philosophy, and you might regard it as a post-liberal one, if you like, is to blend an ethic of socialism with that new liberal tradition, to recognize there is a we and an I, that actually the two conceptions are not incompatible, but can be blended. And running an Oxford College for 9 years of my life, I watched the fellowship doing just that. When my wife was dying, the fellows of the college, all of them relentlessly individualistic in their kind of ambitions for themselves and their subjects and their students and their own research, kind of rallied behind kind of me as principal of the college, and actually to a conception of fellowship that I found really kind of really impressive. And you find in a governing body meeting of these colleges, simultaneously, people being hanging together, asserting the we, their loyalty to this institution, whilst also being kind of exceptionally individualistic. It's possible to blend these two. They're not incompatible. And a post-liberal order, it seems to me, has to do that. And where I get to is what that means practically, is that in any good society where people have lived lives they have reason to value, there must be a social floor below which no one can fall, and that is informed by an ethic of fellowship. Thus housing, thus nutrition, thus education, thus access to public transport. The social floor is kind of an indispensable precondition for kind of any good economy and society. But simultaneously, there must be ladders up which people can climb, floor and ladders, and all housed, I would argue, in a capitalism which is high investment, high innovation, and which is biased to deliver common good outcomes. And that has to be delivered by, inevitably, an active public agency, the state. And I think down that road, you get to a better kind of economic and social order than the one we're currently kind of living in. So how does kind of economic democracy and kind of political democracy cope with that? And I'm going to have a glass of water, actually. I'll swing it up a bottle. Great, thank you. It's quite dry up here, isn't it? I wonder if you yeah. Yeah, thank you. And here I think, something which I think should be said by somebody during the course of either today or tomorrow, which is that globalization's taken a lot of hits, and kind of in a sense quite rightly. But I don't think that, for example, organizing trade unions kind of in the first kind of 7 decades of the 20th century was comparatively easy when you had workplaces which employed 20, 30, 40,000 people. Kind of in 1950 in Britain, similarly across the OECD, you found 50 workplaces where there were 25,000 people and 20 where there were more than 50,000. And it hasn't been globalization which has eliminated those big employment workplaces. It is actually the transformation in the underlying structures in our economy. And we're living through a big kind of a huge transition from a transition from an analog world to a digital world, to a world where service sector employment is where the kind of employment opportunities are in small kind of firms, medium-sized firms, but not the big corporations and big sites of production that we're used to. And when the manifesto that the team have written for the post-liberal order, I hear a kind of a nostalgia for a world in which, there were these huge sources of employment and huge kind of locations for employment. They've gone. And it's not globalization that has caused that, nor is it woke that's caused that. It is actually that we are living in a period of tremendous technological change. And actually, it's kind of rather inspiring. I've been working on a piece of 3 reports that will come out in the first 6 months of next year, which I call the Growth Trilogy, kind of talking to the founders and the venture capitalists who've been supporting the kind of wave of new startups and scale-ups in Britain that are really very impressive. A unicorn is an unquoted company that sold a bunch of shares privately that valued it at more than $1 billion. Britain has 43 unicorns, more per million of population than any country on earth. More than the United States, more than China. Indeed, in absolute numbers, we're only behind the Chinese and the Americans. We're a fantastic, our rate of business startups is again phenomenal, number 3 in the world. And there's a new capitalism coming through in Britain, kind of employing people, growing vigorously, and actually, if properly organized and framed and given an appropriate architecture, could actually deliver the productivity growth in the 5/6 of the economy, which is not dominated by public sector trade unions, that we all want to see. And what I find inspiring about these people, the founders of these kind of unicorns and companies that are near unicorns, is how purpose-driven they are, how mission-driven they are. And that many of the kind of elements that actually the authors of the manifesto kind of call for, kind of living virtuously, kind of accepting obligations to the part of the world in which you're trading, kind of engaging your workforce, treating your customers properly, etc., is actually what they are doing spontaneously in this capitalism where the feedback loops are so rapid, partly because of technology, partly because we have the internet, partly because that's how this new world operates. And actually it's congruent with, I think, an emergent kind of economic democracy. Not the kind of trade unionism that Munira talked about, but a trade unionism which is much more geared towards partnering with these founders and their teams in these new emergent companies. Not actually saying, there is a capitalist surplus, you are a capitalist running dog, we must oppose you to the end, the kind of oppositional trade unionism that actually even Bevan was against, and as someone remarked, constituted the German trade union movement after the war on different principles, leading to co-determination, etc., etc. That road is open to us now in 2025 as we move into it and beyond. And actually, the Labour government is kind of stumbling with its new agenda for work into that universe, in my view. Interestingly and importantly, there's even very near here, in South Cambridgeshire, the county council has actually launched a 4-day working week, not from trade union pressure, but because that is what the workforce absolutely wanted, and there were channels of communication between the people who ran the place and the workforce, which led to this, and it had extraordinary kind of productivity gains across the piece. There are now nearly 1 million people in our workforce, largely in the private sector, not the public sector, who are working 4-day weeks. That is congruent with this emergent new capitalism, and is actually a way I would like to see economic democracy kind of moving in the 21st century. How does kind of politics play into this? Well, I think that in order to get the kind of reconstitute and our venture capital industry, in order to get our pension funds to kind of take more risk, it's incredible that only 1.6% of pension fund assets, £2.4 trillion, are actually invested in British equity. Kind of a benchmark for pension funds around the world is 19%. We have to kind of get that risk capital kind of really getting behind our potential new cohort of consequential, high growth, high innovative, economic democracy respecting kind of companies as they start to move into the second half of the 2020 into the 2030s. an agile state has to do that, and political parties that actually kind of get it. And here I would agree that I don't think that actually, certainly the Conservative Party, that Munira knows better than I, but I mean, talking to leading Tory politicians, I mean, very few of them kind of understand kind of this new capitalism at all. And here's a point. Of all the founders of these firms I've spoken to, not one would consider voting Conservative. They don't buy into kind of conservatism, and they actually do get some of the things that we deride as woke. I mean, they do understand that actually some of the things that kids are saying kind of does make some kind of sense in the third decade of the 21st century. But to have a and this is where it's tricky to say this. I mean, there's a lot of talk in the manifesto, and I agree with it completely. I say it in my book. You know, obviously, one has to kind of empower the local much more than we do. You know, we're highly centralized. Citizens have to feel that actually, if they pull the levers of local voting and local government and local action, things happen. But I'm not sure that is kind of enough. And I think that actually we have to ask, a democracy is operationalized in the end by its political parties. And I don't think that our political parties kind of serve us well at all. I think the kinds of, if we're going to make it attractive for people to go and kind of make a career as a politician, it'd be lovely to see what you have to say about this, actually. But I mean, it's not an attractive thing to do, and our political parties aren't very effective at actually kind of recruiting the spectrum of talent they need to. They don't get people who understand, for example, this new capitalism. The Labour Party is still too full of local government folk, people from NGOs, people from the trade union movement, etc. The Tory Party kind of estate agents and kind of solicitors. But again, it's not kind of the breadth of talent in our political parties is extremely poor. And I'm for actually starting to take some transparency and some accountability of party structures. If we want to get people who can kind of operationalize an iterative, kind of agile, smart state to kind of configure the kinds of institutions we want, to produce the kind of moral, economic, and social possibilities that exist for us, we need to do better than we're currently doing. Lastly, I think we need, in an age of disinformation, we have got to take what's happening in our media and our social media kind of fundamentally kind of more seriously. There was a discussion kind of this morning about what's truth and how to kind of get at truth. You don't get democracy is at its best when you get genuine argument, genuine kind of people having different solutions, different kind of perspectives on how you can get from where we are to where we need to be. And that's vital and really important. The other great advantage of democracy over authoritarianism in a world in which authoritarianism seems to be on the march is it solves a succession crisis. I often wonder what's going to happen, who's going to succeed Putin, who's going to succeed Xi in China and. I mean, actually, democracies, for all their imperfections, kind of do work well, ultimately, it seems to me. But to have a discourse, I mean, the kind of polarization that you have in the States, where there's literally kind of two truths, and indeed watching two politicians from the way that kind of facts get disputed by kind of reform. One of the great disasters of Brexit, I kind of continue to think, is kind of obviously I'm a Remainer, and consider Brexit to have been a kind of act of great self-harm, but perhaps more damagingly, it left a kind of enduring kind of belief on the right in particular that you can tell lies and get away with it. And reform actually fall back on populist lying. And we have to find a way of actually kind of organizing ourselves better. I personally think that if you want to own a media company in Britain, a newspaper, a radio station, a TV station, whatever, a majority of the equity should be held by British nationals. I take the view there should be some form of it should be publicly owned, but it needs to be some kind of semi-autonomous from the state kind of digital platform on which we can kind of tweet and do our kind of our social media interactions with the content actually kind of properly moderated in which you can trust. I mean, some of the AI things that I've seen generated in the last 3 months are really hair-raising. I mean, really, really hair-raising. And you kind of think, if you start believing that, we are really lost as a civilization, whether it's a post-liberal order or not. So, I mean, I finish off by kind of saying the question about political democracy and economic democracy are, in a sense, fundamental, but they're means to this end. What is the end? I think the end is kind of a high investment, high innovation, high employee engagement economy, where we replenish the London stock market's gone from being number 3 in the world to number 11 in the world, and there's only 1% of the capitalization of the London stock market is in high-tech stocks, 30% in the United States. If we're going to replenish our capitalism, revitalize our capitalism, we have to do some of the things I've been kind of discussing this afternoon. I end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will and Jonathan and Munira and Dan, for your really fascinating and at times very personal and very moving remarks for us this afternoon. We have 15 minutes to go before the end of this session, so I will forgo moderating a discussion between panellists, which I chair, because that will take time away from you, the audience, to ask your own questions. But I did want to, the two questions I was going to ask, which maybe our panel can kind of weave into their various answers as we proceed through the next 15 minutes, was one around, perhaps, Dan, this is something that you might be able to pick up, one around the working class. What does that mean in 2024? Has it lost its meaning? What does Starmer understand as a working person? Is it just someone that's on payroll? Or a working mother in the home, or a volunteer in the community, or a family farmer, dare I suggest. And another thing that kind of came to mind as I was listening was the role of organised labour today, and kind of new forms of trade unions, whether that's a guild type operation or some other. And perhaps, Will, that's something that you might be able to ponder as we go on. Are we meeting under Chatham House rules, Adrian?
No, in the sense
No.
that it's a Zoom meeting. No.
Oh, really? I was going to remind everyone that we're meeting under Chatham House rules, particularly for Dan's benefit, being a Member of Parliament and a member of the governing party, but we're not, so hey, sorry, Dan. Anything that you do say will be taken as evidence. By the way, Jonathan, I also made a note here to say that the Conservative Foster Group has revived relatively recently in memory of Roger Scruton, and I think that's a very good thing. Do we have a roaming mic? Yes, we do. Fantastic. Hands up. Freddie, I saw you first. Freddie at the back there.
Thank you very much. Freddie Hayward from the New Statesman. I was in the UK in Westminster, and I've suddenly been exiled to America. Will, I wanted to pick up on your comments about polarization and whether that's a bad thing or not. It seems to me that in America at the moment, the polarization is actually fueling quite a healthy political debate. In the UK, in comparison, we have this prevailing apathy, which is leading to extreme volatility in every 4 or 5 years, and it's partly because there isn't a real dialectic or discussion or a program of oppositional ideas, whereas in America, there were problems and Trump's proposing some solutions, and people can either disagree or not, but there's something to fight over. In the UK, it seems to be in a more sorry state because of the apathy and the absence of polarisation.
Could we just hold that thought there? And I want to take a few more, because there are lots and lots of hands up. Michael Gove, could we hear your question? If the microphone could very speedily, like pass the parcel, but quicker, make its way to Michael. Thank you.
Listening to Munira, I thought the problem perhaps is not that we have too many people in trade unions, but too few. The problem that we have is that the trade union movement was sensible when we had a significant number of people in the manufacturing sector who depended on the success of private enterprise in order to ensure that their wages and conditions improved. And it's been deindustrialization which has been one of the biggest problems in essentially ensuring that the sensible part of the left has diminished in force. And then for Jonathan, I would say that conservatism, of course, can never die, because conservatism is just essentially the political intuitions that spring from human nature. And whatever form conservative parties may take, conservatism, because it's not an ideology, because it's simply a recognition of what our greatest thinkers from Aristotle to Aquinas have recognized, conservatism endures forever. And I'm just going to say to Dan, everything that you said about housing I completely understood and resonated with me. One of the biggest challenges that we have is that more and more of the rental sector is in the hands of people who have no geographical link and no sense of responsibility towards those to whom they are exercising the responsibility of landlords. And then finally, Will, I was going to say, it was very interesting when you talked about the new digital entrepreneurs who have a sense of mission. Which of them do you most admire? Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, or Jeff Bezos?
Okay, over to the panel. 2 questions there, targeted at various panellists. Jonathan, yes, why don't you go first?
Is this working?
Is it working?
Can I reply to Michael Gove's point about too few people in trade unions? I entirely agree. When I worked in the United States, I found that, without intending it, I became the elected president of my local academic trade union, and I worked hard so far as I could. I couldn't transform the system, but I could do something to achieve justice in the workplace, and it's a marvelous and laudable goal, which I recommend to people. His second point, though, that conservatism can never die, whatever happens to the Conservative Party, does that apply also to socialism and liberalism? And of course, if these things are rooted in human nature, why were they not visible at all times and in all places? But as an historian, I want to argue that they are historical formations in particular times and particular places, and that they therefore experience the fortunes of all such ideologies, namely from conceptualization to hegemony to deconceptualization.
Will, any remarks? Or Munira? Yeah, Munira, why don't you go?
Just to Michael's point, I'm certainly not against trade unions in principle. All I was trying to say is that they can also tend towards monopolies, and they can be enormous concentrations of power, which can be a block on progress. So I completely agree. And in fact, I would argue to reform certain laws which mean that trade unions have the exclusive right to represent members in particular professions like teachers, and which I think is a problem. I think there should be some degree of choice that people can choose who represents them.
Okay, I think I quite like the challenge of a clean sheet for the future, and what that allows us to think. But the challenge, I mean, I always trust, and I mean this quite seriously, the public mood, and I kind of look at what's happened in the US, and I feel a confidence from the fact that people voted, and there was a public mood for what can only be described as change and a reset to what was happening. And I wasn't shocked, like colleagues, about Trump's victory. In fact, I was over in the US predicting it to almost all the people I met who were telling me that Kamala Harris was going to win. But I saw that when Kamala Harris was being asked what she would do for struggling families, working people, she had nothing to say. And Trump said radical things. He was going to put tariffs on. He was going to restart factories. You know, it was not a surprise to me at all to see him win. And I think the biggest challenge here is the exploitation of people the fact that work doesn't pay, the fact that landlords can exploit tenants, and we need a clean sheet, and we need some ideas for how people have a say or participate in the things that affect their lives, because the things that I see as a local MP are the devastating frustration of public services that are totally unresponsive, a market that fails people, and I feel like the public mood and this idea of a reset, is something that is out there in communities, and that us politicians have to rise to and make sure that change comes.
Will, do you have anything to add? You don't have to, me.
Well, on the question about my colleague, the New Statesman, of course, it's kind of American political debate is fascinating and lively. But, if you're on the right, to have to collude in the fiction that the election wasn't lost in 2020, to be party to the kind of weaponizing of the Department of Justice when he takes over on Jan 20th, to kind of retribution on kind of hundreds of people that have he taken personal kind of dislike to or believes he's been offended by, to kind of consider kind of appointing at the Department of Health a person who doesn't believe in vaccines. To kind of intensify a kind of the rule of law into a kind of this kind of world of lawfare in which actually it really matters what political affiliation the kind of judges in your court. These are problematic, in my view. You live there and you watch it, but I consider it problematic. And a lot of my friends in the States, kind of across the political spectrum, regard it as problematic too. I'm all for kind of really going at each. Democracies require, aggression, exchange of ideas, etc. But there has to be some kind of common ground, some recognition that the rules of the game kind of have to be observed. If you lose an election, you lose an election. You don't say because you lost it, the rules were rigged in some way, and then spend 4 years denying it and forcing everybody in your party to collude with you and kind of in denying truth. And then you get into a civilization and a political culture in which truth denial becomes kind of acceptable. So in that sense, I'm against the polarization in the States. Yeah, I think it's. I give you it's fascinating, and I give you it produces and has forced people, particularly on the kind of liberal left, to kind of think foundationally. And that's I think in the long run going to be healthy, and I'm sure the United States will get to the other side of this. But actually, pro tem, I don't think kind of that you can say it's all fantastic. Kind of Donald Trump's wonderful, and he deserves to be Man of the Year, and actually nothing could be healthier for American civilization than what's taken place. I just defer. I can push back on it really. And Michael Gove, thank you. I am impressed, though. Of course, I have my, that trio is a particularly unlovely trio, but I am impressed when you talk to the kind of scale-ups that I've talked to in the UK. How, maybe it's a different kind of political culture and social culture that we live in, but they're very, very, very purpose-driven, in a good sense. So I don't know. And whether people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk should actually get so. I think there's been a degradation in both men actually, as they've got kind of as their wealth has moved into kind of incredible scale. I think. Musk's operation is kind of. The AI-driven kind of tweeting that's going on, kind of in many languages, kind of funded by the enormous wealth he has, the $100 million he may give reform in the UK. I don't consider that. I'm not sure that Elon Musk of 15 years ago was that kind of person. I think that he's been degraded by kind of the extravagance of the money that he's got. But I do think that. I want to hold my ground a bit, and I do think certain people I've come across in the UK, I would actually happily introduce you to them, and I think you'd probably share my admiration for them.
Munira, you would like to respond?
I mean, only just to, I certainly don't want to defend disinformation on the right, but I would just point out that, President Biden said that he would not pardon his son, and Democrats went on for a long time saying he would not pardon his son, and then he pardoned his son. I think there's fault on both sides when it comes to disinformation.
That's my point, though, that you see,
Yeah.
But that's my point. I mean, what happens? You have a kind of a race to the bottom, and actually, you have a race to the bottom. I'll say no more than that.
You may, Jonathan.
Briefly, when I worked in the US, I never involved myself, even by sympathy, with US politics. I always thought the Republicans were too far to the left for me, and the Democrats were too far to the right. and now I'm in the UK and no longer a member of any political party, and although I ridiculed the 3 party manifestos, I often find that people across the political spectrum, if there is one, have all sorts of interesting ideas which I think deserve to be explored. And I do suggest there is more room for political cooperation and the development of good ideas than maybe our party system and party rivalry has allowed for in recent decades.
It is 5:44. I'm going to take 2 more questions from the gentleman at the front here and from David Campanale. One after the other, please. So Sebastian, microphone here. And then I'm going to ask all, just this gentleman. And then I'm going to ask all 4 panellists to respond if they would like to, or offer some concluding remarks.
This is a quick question for Will Hutton. Your 42 unicorns, how many people do they employ?
And David Campanale.
I've got a question to the panel to pick up from what Will has said about shared assumptions. There is an institution that belongs to the British people. 32 million people a week listening to it. I out myself as a former chair of the National Union of Journalists and BBC News in London. And that's, of course, the BBC. And the question I've got is this, about those shared assumptions. How far are they rooted in the Christian worldview of the originators of the BBC? And how far has a departure from those ruling assumptions, to use a Marxist phrase, account for the drift in the sense of its support amongst the wider British public? It's the feeling that it's disconnected.
Let me squeeze in just one more. Gentleman here at the front, Sebastian, thank you.
One thing that I would like the panel to address that I don't think you have addressed is really what I think is the real gist of Donald Trump's presidency is the the goal of dismantling the administrative state. Because if you're talking about political participation, I think one of the key elements of kind of modern democracies that's degraded political participation is the expansion of the administrative state and the welfare state that has taken lots of decisions of people's everyday lives and put it into government bureaucracies. That's my question. Is how does that play into it? I think it's crucial, but I haven't heard that much about it.
Let's start with you, Dan, and then let's work our way along, and then we'll have to draw stumps.
Yeah, I'll be quick. And I talked about the public mood, and I look at America and I think people were willing to vote for Trump's rhetoric because they felt like the promises that had been made by the established politicians of the last 30 or 40 years didn't materialize. They were promised they were going to be better off, and they weren't. And so it doesn't shock me that people are willing to kind of suck that up as sort of part of saying there needs to be a reset. And I would just make the plan on wider issues that I think time for greater national planning, greater purpose, greater localism and participation are what are in the kind of the public feeling at the moment.
On the administrative state, I think I was trying to refer to that a bit with my comments about HR and the HRification of organisations, which as I said, my colleague Pamela Dow has written about. And I think it's that way in which workers' rights or employment rights are now being reconceptualised as a legal framework, as opposed to the traditional form of trade unions exerting power and a contest of interests. And I think that administrative state that you're talking about is a serious problem in the UK as well as in the US.
I'd just like to go back to a point I made earlier and refine it or correct it a little. I said that the slate had already been wiped clean so that we could just go forward. But it occurs to me that it's not been completely wiped clean. And there are some terms which need, I think, to be deleted from our lexicon if we are to be free of illusions. And let me give you the terms left, right, and centre. Left and right were derived from voluntary seating arrangements in the French National Assembly in the 1790s. They tell us nothing today about whether we agree with our colleagues or not. Capitalism. All economies employ capital, whether they're command economies or mixed economies or private enterprise economies. Class. Humanity is not divided into layers called social classes. That doesn't help us. Let's find different ways of talking about it. Race. Let's have a real discussion of race. Skin color is not race. Skin color is skin color. There is only one race, scientifically, and that is the human race. And as soon as we stop talking about races in the plural, then the more tolerant we can become in our day-to-day relations. But can I just lastly pick up a very good point that Will Hutton made about the importance of fraternity. Let's remember the French revolutionary ideals: liberty, equality, and fraternity. You can legislate to institute liberty quite successfully. To implement equality, that is economic equality, is a lot harder, but you can get there. You can get a long way in that direction. But to introduce fraternity is very, very, very hard. And I question whether it can be done by even the most well-meaning of political parties.
Just 2 or 3 points. I mean, on your question about numbers employed, about 100,000. So it's small. The high growth, small and medium-sized firms, probably around 2 million people. But it's not trivial. And they're building blocks for what could be a kind of regenerate the British economy, in my view. I mean, and I'd go hell for leather if I was the British government. I thought it was a really interesting point by the BBC. I did, in my remarks, actually, I wanted to make if you want, it seems to me the BBC is an indispensable kind of institution in this sense that it may be that it's kind of less trusted than it was, but it's still one of the most trusted media outlets. And actually, at moments of crisis, people turn to it first for information. Really important that one upholds the BBC and the tradition of public service broadcasting that goes with it. Christianity as its and wreath, and whether we're, as we move to a secular society, that makes us more disaffected with the BBC. I've never heard that before, and I have to mull over it. I'm not certain that I buy that. I think that there's bigger stuff abroad that's leading to kind of disaffection about what you hear and see. Lastly, I want to pick up your point about fellowship and what you call fraternity. I should have said in my remarks that Tony Blair's revised Clause 4 actually does attempt to produce this blend of an ethic of socialism, the we, and this new liberal idea of individualism in which responsibility is kind of the reciprocal kind of value for kind of enlarging kind of individual possibilities. That's the new Clause 4. That's what, remember, the Labour Party stands for. And it is actually an attempt to forge a new ideology. that Tony Blair didn't do very much with it in office, and that actually very few Labour politicians actually kind of know kind of the roots of that Clause 4 and the way it did try to marry kind of new liberalism and an ethic of socialism in itself. Testimony, I think, to kind of where we've got to, maybe in a post-liberal order, it is kind of one beacon of kind of solidity and hope. I would say that.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we thank our panellists in the usual way?